Trayte, who is sitting next to Todd, is a historical architect with the Technical Preservation Services Division of the National Park Service in Washington, D.C. In that capacity, David facilitates the federal tax credit program in Connecticut, Delaware, Illinois, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Texas, and Virginia. So he has a wide breadth of projects to draw from for this conversation. And finally, Alyssa has been with the SHPO for a little over 2 years, managing the Historic Restoration Grant Program and the Historic Homes Rehabilitation Tax Credit. And again, I'm Julie Carmelich. I've been with the SHPO for the past 10 years, and while there, I have administered the larger of the two state tax credit programs, as well as serving as the state's administrator for the federal historic tax credit program. So the goal of today's session is to provide everyone with a better understanding, not just of the Secretary of the Interior standards, but also an understanding of the SHPO and National Park Service's review process across our various programs, including tax credits, the Historic Restoration Fund, and Section 106. We want this to be an active discussion. We will talk about the posters in a minute, as I said, but I do want to allow David an opportunity to provide us with a little background about the standards, why they're important to historic preservation, and to the work that all of us do. So I'm going to pass it off to David.
Thanks, Julie. I appreciate the opportunity to join you guys today. So I know we're talking back to basics, and some of you in this room are very familiar with the Second Interior Standard, to the point where you could probably be sitting up here giving these comments yourself. But in the theme of today's conference and this weekend, so the Second Interior Standard is for the treatment of historic properties. There are 4 treatments included in this: preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction. And these are the basic preservation principles that we all, from the federal, state, down to local level, work with. And these promote the preservation of best practices to protect cultural resources at all those varying levels. The standards are concepts about repair, replacements. They also cover additions or other alterations. And these, what's important to know about the standards, these are codified. This is in the Code of Federal Regulations, and they're regulatory for all of our review, from the federal and again down to the state, and even local design guidelines. And that dates back to even the 1966 National Historic Preservation Act, where Congress basically delegated to the Secretary of the Interior to establish these professional standards. And then more so in 1976 with the Tax Act, which I think a lot of us here deal with, and how that came to be. So again, if you take the regulatory side of that, and then we also pair that with the guidelines for preserving, rehabilitating, restoring, reconstructing historic buildings. We have very long, lengthy names for all these documents. So we kind of have these 2 components to that, and the guideline is the more advisory side to that. It provides technical assistance and examples that you then pair with the framework of the regulatory standards. And together, these help all of us in the review side, as well as you, if you're working with buildings or preparing these applications. It helps us make the decisions in that process. I think one of the big comments I hear a lot in our office here is that, guys, the standards have been around for a long time. Times change. What are you guys doing? What's happening here? I will say in 2006, there was a committee of the National Park System Advisory Board that took a look at the standards and the program and assessed, are these still accurate, true, and good representation of what's happening in this movement and industry? And at the time, it was determined that they were appropriate and no changes made. And then to, again, respond, I think, to that criticism, a couple years ago in 2017, our office, the National Park Service, had updated the guidelines and published the updated version, which included modern materials and modern issues that a lot of us are seeing and facing in these buildings that they necessarily weren't having 2 or 3 decades ago. So I think that is the side that is important as we again look at pairing that, the regulatory advisory side, and updated the guidelines to help with that. So why this is important, the standards give us those basic framework guidelines to make these decisions on it, and kind of set that benchmark for everybody across again, all levels of regulatory review.
Great. Thank you, and you got us right back on schedule. Yes?
You have those standards on a handout?
So the standards that we often refer to for rehabilitation, there are 10 standards. Those are available on our website. I don't know if we have them printed out here today.
I didn't prepare handouts, but I'm more than happy to provide them after the conference, if you want to shoot me an email or...
But you can easily find those on the National Park Service website as well.
Also, I will have a slide at the end of this presentation that will share links to a lot of the stuff that we'll be talking about today, so you can also sit tight and maybe take a photograph of the screen.
Are the most recent ones from 2017? I found something online that were revised by Ann E. Grimmer.
Correct. The 2017, those are the guidelines that she's referring to. Those are updated, and there's a link on our website for that as well. It's a lengthy document, a PDF, but it's searchable, so if you have a particular issue, you can look for it there.
So when you talk about standards, it says there seem to be 4 categories: preserving, rehabilitating, restoring, and reconstructing. And so each one of those is a separate concept related to a historic building, and then your tax credits and all that other stuff are the next overlays that a person seeking to study on how to proceed. You would first refer to these guidelines, the standards, Secretary of Interior standards, and thereafter we would look on your website and see what grants or tax credits might be applicable. Would that be the...
No, the programs that are administered by the State Historic Preservation Office and the National Park Service use those standards and guidelines, but the programs themselves are run from our office. You can, if you're looking for any programmatic information, you can always check out our website. But the purpose of this session is to give everybody an understanding, specifically to the rehab standards, how our office and the National Park Service review projects using those standards. So I'd like to kind of get started with the next part of this session, which is we want to hear from you. Why you made the decisions you made, the determinations you made on the posters across at the side of the room there. So we're going to take them a little bit out of order, and we're going to start with case study number 2, which is the museum. Yeah, the museum property. Rhonda is there at the side of the room. I would like to hear first from people who decided that no, this project did not meet the standards, and I'd like to hear why and what your thought process was. So who's going to be the first brave person to get up and share?
I said no because of the word all. I said all interior petitions, and so it sounded like some were significant and many were not. So.
Okay. All right. Yep.
I think I was one of the few people who said yes.
Okay, great.
And my feeling was that the partitions were all imposed into the space later. They were later additions. I had a lot of conjecture, but it seemed like the benefits to the space that were being offered by the proposal would outweigh the loss of later additional materials, perhaps taking the building back to more of its original formation.
Okay. And so just to be clear too, I understand these are posters. You have about 3 sentences to make a decision. There is a whole kind of backstory and a whole negotiation, but we just want, so don't be afraid to share your feelings, because we do understand that, you couldn't get the whole project in on the poster, but we hope that to give you kind of the most salient and thought-provoking points. Anybody here?
I think considering what they're trying to do by setting up a museum, they're displacing a lot of the integrity and the materials that are already in the house. So they're sacrificing one side in order to save others. Saving a tin roof on an early building is really important and facet. So I voted no, because you can't let the fabric of the building go just to save something else that may not be worth saving.
So this project came to us under the Historic Restoration Fund grant, so I'm gonna have Alyssa pick up from here to kind of fill in some of the blanks and her thought process. And then, if you guys have any other thoughts or questions, feel free to chime in too.
Okay, so good morning, everybody. So, yes, this was a Historic Restoration Fund grant project. It was a historical society/museum that came to us with this proposal. And as you read on the poster, their main objective was to create a museum environment for their collections. And then there was also some supplemental electrical work that they felt they needed to do. So they were proposing to rip out all of those interior finishes to achieve those goals. And what's important about this case study is that the main block, the interior finishes were not original to the structure, but about 100 years old from when the structure became a museum. And then there was an addition on the back that was also historic from the 1800s, but the interior finishes were from the late 1900s. So they were from not the original and not from the museum transition, but from a much later time period. So ultimately, we decided that ripping out all of those interior finishes in the main block did not meet the standards. Some might argue that, well, they're not original to the structure, so why can't we take them out? And one of the standards that we follow is that it's acquired significance. So even though something is not original, the standards for rehabilitation call for respecting features or elements of the building's history that have acquired significance in there already. And we decided as a staff that this transition from what it was originally to a museum over 100 years ago was significant enough to preserve. The addition, on the other hand, while the addition was historic and from the 1800s, the interior finishes were not, and they were from a much later period in time that did not represent a historic trend, it did not represent a significant moment in the building's history. So we felt that yes, they could take out interior finishes in that addition, where they could not do it in the main block. So there was a complex conversation, complex pieces to this project, and we know we have a lot of historical societies and a lot of museums that come and use our program, and we love them, but it's a complex issue to balance the environment for the collections and what is great or good for the preservation of the building and preserving the building. So it's a hard balance to achieve, and we recognize that, but unfortunately in this instance there was just too much disruption of that original or historic fabric rather, and we couldn't find that balance.
So now you've been filled in on a little bit more of the background. Does anybody have a different opinion? Does anybody want to share or have questions or share more of their thoughts about this project?
This comes up numerous times. I work for the Schubert Theater here in New Haven. We've already utilized historic tax credits to renovate a portion of our building. We actually have our original portion is from 1914, and then our addition was in 1983. And I know, Julie, we've been through this. And at what point do we look at then the sustainability of the people, of the organization utilizing that place? If the place is no longer able to function as a museum, and it closes down, because it's not operationally sustainable, where does the historic and preservation fall between that? I know we've had the conversations of, well, our lobby has to function for us to be sustainable. It's kind of historic in the sense of 1983, but not really. So where do you find that balancing point of keeping our the organization sustainable, but also preserving the history that happened within them? So it's always
Someone take that?
I'll chime in just in relation to the case study that we were just discussing, and Todd can chime in too, because he joined me on this site visit and a lot of the conversations. But in this particular instance, yes, that is absolutely a question that we ask. And not only, it helps us, number one, better understand where you're coming from, and helps us, give us a jumping off point for helping find other maybe potential alternatives. In this case, we did have that exact discussion. And while this project didn't ultimately decide to come through our office, they were putting an addition on the property. And so we were exploring alternative ways to create this museum environment that could leave the main building intact, and so they could still achieve that mission while preserving historic fabric. So it's helpful to inform us, but also, we love to come to the table and sort of brainstorm ideas and alternatives.
Yeah, and I'll just add that, when we look at projects, we look at the cumulative effect, so we try to find compromises where we can, and there are certain things that you just can't compromise on. So you get to a point where there's, we make every effort we can to meet, our constituents halfway. But sometimes there's certain things that are too character defining, too significant, that define that site that must be retained. So then we try to find compromises that go maybe out the back with an addition, or less significant features might be lost to keep the more significant features.
Okay, one more, and then we're going to
One more real quick. Just to say, hi, my name is Mary. I work for FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. So this is an issue we deal with a lot. In fact, one of our projects is up there. But we frequently come to a situation where we try to avoid adverse effects wherever we can. But sometimes in order to move the mission forward, in order to preserve the overall property, we do have to just accept an adverse effect. Mitigate it, minimize it as much as we can, and then move on. But adverse effects are, especially moving forward with all the climate change issues we have, going to be kind of a way of life, and we just got to kind of find a way that we can protect the properties to the best of our ability, but not let it stop us from doing what we need to do.
And we'll talk more about that when we talk about the carousel project, because that falls squarely under Section 106. The same isn't always true for our tax credit and grant programs, but we'll talk about those nuances as we move forward. So we're going to jump around again. We're going to talk about case study number 3. As you read, this was a 4-story downtown urban center building that was historically a lodge hall for the Oddfellows, I believe. It came to us under the state and federal tax credit program, and both David and I worked on the review of this project. So it looks like we're pretty evenly split. Anybody want to take a crack at talking about their decision-making process and what they thought about the project? Kim?
I voted no because the large voluminous spaces that were character-defining features of the hall it seems like they were just entirely eliminated by subdividing the park. So I think that would have been a no for me.
Anybody want to talk about why they voted yes? Bruce?
I know buildings like this are, can be challenging to reuse. I happen to know that buildings were vacant for quite a long time, and it's probably going to either continue to be vacant or to use it economically. And there has to be the second floor open spaces don't really have a use in downtown cities. The office markets are soft, but there is a need for housing. So if in the process of repositioning the building, if those upper floors were they're less significant, but it seemed a reasonable compromise to me. But I know these are all judgment calls, and maybe the question is there another alternative that would be economically viable? If there was, then that might be preferred. But if, I wonder, in looking at the standards, both the SHPO and the Park Service does sort of step back and think, is this the best we can do? As opposed to just saying no, and then having the building deteriorate for another decade or two.
Sure. So, anybody else?
I also went with yes on this, and I was making some assumptions, mostly based on the floor plan that was shown on the poster. The conditions I throw on that is the tin ceiling. If you can put in partition walls, new elements that ultimately could be at some future date and you decided to go back to this, you weren't, if you kept the tin ceiling, that would be a condition, you weren't removing original material that hadn't already been lost. You were adaptively reusing the space and keeping it vibrant. So I got the yes vote on this, that it would meet the rehabilitation standards.
Do you want to start that conversation? Do you want me to start?
You can go ahead.
Okay. So the project came to us as pretty much described in the panel. They had proposed, the owner had proposed putting in units throughout the historic gathering spaces of the lodge members. And despite the fact that, in fact, they were doing a very good job of preserving building fabric that existed in the building, we did go back to them and suggest that, in fact, no, this does not meet the standards for us. That the historic gathering spaces were, in fact, the character-defining feature of this building. It is called the IOOF Lodge Building, and so these were spaces that we believed were purpose-built and meant to be preserved for the future. And in order to qualify for a tax credit, needed to be considered in the overall plan. So there was discussion with the owner, and do you want to add anything to?
Yeah, sure. So I think a couple interesting points have been brought up here, and one is the notion of hierarchy of space as you move upward in the building. In some instances that is true, where as you go higher in the building, perhaps the less significant the space was, and perhaps there'd be more flexibility in what you could do in those areas depending on the type of building. But to Julie's point, this is a purpose-built gathering space where the whole function of the building is defined by that volume, that spatial volume that was there. And that existed typically on these buildings on upper floors. But we have, you come into the building, there were other secondary uses on lower floors or basement, and then the gathering space with the large volumes on the upper floors of the building. So that is character defining again to that building. The other point is material versus spatial configuration. And while we have historical material, that is, obviously we want to be careful about that and look at that and how it defines the space. But again, the spatial volume, the very basis of this building, was the impetus to what was happening here. And Kim, I think you made the point of, well, there was already a subdivision in this space, and so there was already alterations that were done. We didn't have the true original volume of the gathering space, which we certainly take into consideration. The issue then becomes, we still have a sense of volume. I think Julie and I were trying to recall exactly, I think it was 5 bays of that room. It was defined by 5 bays, and there was an existing partition between bay 2 and 3. So we had 2 bays existing and 3 bays existing. And ultimately what we decided would meet the standards is to subdivide further the smaller 2-bay section, because that was the smaller component of that space. But the majority of that space in the 3 bays was still open, as you see in that photograph, and that needed to be retained, because that was expressing what the function of this building historically was, again, character defining to this structure.
And the economics of this project were certainly mentioned and brought up and discussed, because to your point, Bruce, if the numbers don't work for the owner under the conditions and circumstances that we're outlining for the rehabilitation, that's the reality that we all work with. So luckily, it worked out. And to my knowledge, they've started construction and it's moving forward and everybody's happy. So that's good. It'll be a nice new addition to the downtown area when it's all finished.
So, what was the answer? Yes and no?
The answer as presented was no, as we gave on the poster. But through negotiations and further discussion, we were able to get to a yes. And I just want to make sure too that, it was mentioned, Todd mentioned, but that negotiation process is very important. And part of our process as reviewers of projects using the standards we never want to give a hard no. We never want to just say, yeah, no, it's your problem now. We're good, see you later. We always want to be a part of that negotiation because we always want to make sure that, these programs are meant to be used, and they're meant, preservation is something that not everybody's familiar with, and so we want to make sure that we are gaining allies, that we're building a community, and we do that through repeated conversations and education and negotiation, particularly on tax credit projects.
So what was the use of that larger space
What will it be? The post-rehab?
Ultimate reuse, that you saved the 3-bay space.
Oh, residential, those are apartments.
I think you mean the space we asked them to preserve. I think it will be a community gathering space, either for the residents or there's some office spaces too on the second floor, so it will be used, and so it'll be nice to have that space. Anyone want to talk about, in the context of the full project, about the decisions that we made? Yeah.
So if the developer had just come back and said, no, I cannot find a feasible use for this larger space, you would still have considered going along with that?
No, I think if he had said no, we can't economically do that, we would have had to do that on our own. Yeah.
And also, one other quick point on that comes down to a standard one issue where the intended use, you have an existing building and you need to find a compatible use for that building. Just because the market is such that you are looking for one particular use and trying to force it into a building, it doesn't work. That's the basic standard one issue. But again, in this case, we were able to make something work that I think was successful for everybody.
And I'll just add, Julia mentioned education. Often when we're negotiating with developers or owners who want to do something that we don't quite agree with that follows standards, through the process of us showing them standards and explaining how the standards work, often we find that through that process they recognize that these spaces are indeed important and should be retained. So that's why we often have success when we negotiate. It's not just, we give you something, you give us something back, but also there's that education.
And I will also add that it is sometimes, specifically in grant situations where maybe there's a completely new use for a building, we'll ask, have you done a market study? Or I ask a lot of nonprofits, do you have a strategic plan? Why are you making this decision? Because it helps us ensure that, when we're taking everything into consideration and finding this overall assessment, that the decision's going to be sustainable for the building too, that this isn't being done on a whim, but that it's strategic and that it's going to be viable too.
Yeah, I have a question. I actually was approached by a developer just last week who owns an historic mill building, and he's interested in converting it into apartments. And like many old mill buildings, it's purpose-built, and it has these vast, long spaces, tall windows, exposed framing. Would housing in such a building be disallowed because of the way it would change the character of that purpose-built space?
We're going to get our money's worth there.
Okay. Well, I point to Julie because Julie's always the first stop in this process of the work through the tax credit program, and she does a very nice job and works really hard. So I just want to commend Julie here for all that work. Our office had made a decision years ago, I think probably in the 80s, even maybe earlier, where we, especially in this region of the country, where we have all these big mill buildings, what do you do with them? They're huge volumes of space, they often have several buildings in them. We have determined that it would be acceptable to subdivide for residential use or perhaps commercial use, whatever. So we do regularly accept subdivision of mill spaces. Our concern is finishes, maintaining the character of those industrial mills with walls, floors, ceilings, how we're treating that. But we can certainly work those out as you guys start that process. But the simple answer is yes, we do allow subdivision of large mills.
When you evaluate a proposal, do you always make a site visit?
I do try to do a site visit to every project, or a meeting, at our office to review plans. Particularly with new applicants, it helps to have a preliminary meeting to kind of go over the plan for the building, but also provide the owner with an understanding of how the tax credit process works. I think the rest of the SHPO staff does a lot of site visits and holds a lot of meetings under their programs as well. So it is something that we regularly do. I will say I don't always do a post-rehab site visit, but I am also available to conduct site visits during construction too, if anybody has a question, as you know, because very often, as I'm sure we all know, once you actually get into rehab, things come up, and decisions need to be made pretty quickly. So I want to keep moving. This is a great conversation. This is exactly what I wanted from this panel. So I hope everybody's enjoying the conversation and getting some stuff out of it. But I do want to move on to make sure we get to some of the other issues that often come up. And this one I'm really excited about. I see that some people didn't even want to make a decision. Come on, you guys. This is a tough one, and I think it raises a lot of issues that we will be facing more and more in the next 10, 15, 20 years to come. So, anybody want to start off this conversation? Bob?
I'm the one who put the thing on the line.
Yeah.
Just so you know.
Okay. You weren't the only one.
It was a tough question because of the resiliency issue.
Yeah.
And I think the attempt is made to emulate the original material. Whether that is far enough because of the nature of the new material, I wasn't sure, so I split my vote.
Yeah. And Mary, we'll get to you in a minute. Anybody else?
Can you define the problem, because I didn't get to that word.
Oh, okay. So,
Yeah, so I'll just briefly explain. So what happened in 2011 hurricane, this is a carousel on Lighthouse Point Park in New Haven. This is on the National Register in 1983. It's carousel, wood carousel, and 2011, Hurricane Irene came through, damaging the wood apron around the carousel. As you see, there's a wood apron that goes around. It was, used to be hardwood. It was replaced in kind in 2011. 2012, Hurricane Sandy came through, and we went through a process of environmental review. The city of New Haven came in and applied for a grant from FEMA. We were awarded 120-ish grand to do the repairs. Didn't include the floor replacement in the scope of work, yet went ahead and replaced the hardwood with the stamped concrete. 2015, we caught wind of it. During a review from FEMA, found out that it's an adverse effect, went back to them and said, hey, this is a problem, what are we going to do about it? But there's two main components here to think about. One is the process was skirted, so that's a big problem for the Section 106 law, the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. But also that they replaced historic fabric with a different material that wasn't approved.
Mary?
Yeah. I could speak to the process issue too.
Yes, so this was, as Todd said, a FEMA project. We actually run into this kind of scenario, unfortunately, frequently. When FEMA comes in, we try to get things as soon as possible in the aftermath of a disaster, but sometimes it's a couple years before they come, before our office, the Historic Preservation Office, so we have after-the-fact reviews. In this case, they did make an alteration to the building without talking to us or the SHPO's office about it. We reviewed it. Our take on it was that we have money associated with hazard mitigation funding in order to prevent future damage to structures. We decided that while this was hazard mitigation and it would avoid future damage to the structure and avoid them having to repeatedly replace this wood, they had to do it 2 years in a row, that it still had adverse effect because it changed the character of the setting and the feeling of the area, and that it impacted the structure. So we said we would approve it, but only if they did compensatory mitigation, in this case, updating the National Historic Register nomination to include the renovated carousel, because the original time it was written, it was done before the carousel had been renovated, and it looked, it had gone through a fair amount of restoration since then. So, but definitely an adverse effect in our opinion.
So the questions raised is what would not be an adverse effect? So if you look at this project, from our point of view, following Secretary of Interior standards, we have a wood apron that's been damaged, destroyed by coastal storm surge, happened twice in a row. We know this is going to happen again. What would be an acceptable replacement material? So had we gone through this process with the owner, we would have probably suggested a couple of different things and had them look into it. Like, for instance, perhaps a removable wood floor that would be taken out when there is expected storm surge, or taken off season. Another alternative might have been these new species of hardwood that are growing out of the country that are really dense, like our historic wood. Our historic wood from 100, 200 years ago grew differently than it does today. So it's more dense and it's more resistant to rot and water damage. Well, there's new species of wood being grown that are just as dense, if not more in some cases. So we would have gone through a process of determining if one of those two options would work, and probably land somewhere there. One of the problems with this material, stamped concrete, it's already failed. I don't know if you can see, but that stamped concrete from what was 6 years ago is cracked already. So so it's already failed.
Yeah, and just to say, they already removed portions of the carousel when they know a storm is coming through. So we would have actually preferred removable panels ourselves. That's part of it. They already, to Todd's point about the removable sections, that's generally a difficult point for applicants because they have to go in and do additional work. But in this case, before the storms come in, they actually remove the horses and the decorative panels to the top of the carousel. So asking them to remove one other element would not have been as great an impact.
So David, I'm hopping on the spot again. This raises a lot of interesting questions about the use of substitute materials, about climate change, and how do we evaluate projects in that context. You review a lot of projects up and down the East Coast with, Delaware, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and certainly Texas has storm damage issues as well. How does the National Park Service talk about substitute materials and in general, but then if you could talk a little bit perhaps about specific to repeated damage that we see as a result of climate change?
Yeah, it's a very sometimes challenging question on our end as well. Our guidance always says, obviously, repair first and foremost, or replace the line if deteriorated beyond that point. And so that's always what we're looking for up front, but we do take into consideration these factors, and we are aware and acknowledging that these events are occurring and occurring repeatedly, unfortunately. We've been open to discussion on those elements, and it varies case by case. We look at every project individually, and approval of something on one project is not precedent for approval on another. But I will say that this also kind of ties into other natural elements like seismic issues that we see on the West Coast, where something has to be done. We acknowledge that something has to happen, and where is that compromise that would satisfy the standards and for our program, but also gives you the flexibility to meet the regulations or requirements that you're having to deal with and facing these. So I think that it is something that we have in consideration. We'd certainly be open to those discussions of what the replacement materials would be. We're looking for things that, in terms of appearance, characteristics, trying to find something that's close and compatible as possible so we don't lose those character-defining features that, especially in this case, would be. So it's certainly something that we also acknowledge and are willing to have that discussion on. It's not just a hard no because of the standards say it is. that's something we all have to react to.
And I'll just add that, this is an issue that is only going to get worse. So we realize that we have to come with creative ways to protect and preserve our historic resources that are on the coast. We've been working on resiliency planning here in Connecticut pretty hard. We got our own funding from Hurricane Sandy to develop resiliency planning for the state of Connecticut. We're working right now with Rebuild by Design. There's a big HUD grant that is doing a template project in Bridgeport to plan for exactly this next storm and how do we protect our historic buildings from the next storm and the one after that. So we're hoping that project in Bridgeport becomes a template for the rest of the country. So we're trying to be the forefront of making decisions that will protect our historic places rather than some people who are already saying things like, well, why are we investing state and federal funds into these buildings that are on the coast are going to be gone in 50 years? So let's not bother. And then our office should certainly, and I'm sure the National Park Service doesn't quite agree with that statement.
Yes.
Who was the owner of the carousel?
City of Detroit.
So the relationship isn't continuous as far as the dialogue between your office and the municipality, like they will frequently do what they want.
Yeah, so we actually have a good relationship with the city of New Haven now. We're working very closely with, we actually have Alyssa right here from the city. But we work very closely with those guys. And we try to, again, when we have these problems, we develop a relationship. So that, now AJ can tell you all about the secretary of interior standards, where that, where 7 years ago, 8 years ago, nobody could. So, or some people could, but certainly the people who were making decisions didn't recognize how important historic fabric was and how they do it. So that's one of the things we try to develop with all of our decisions as we go through all these processes, through environmental review, tax credits, in the city.
Hi, my name is Alyssa with the City of New Haven, City Plan. I have a question it's a little bit off topic from these particular case studies. These are all sort of very special and charismatic individual buildings that you're using as case studies. One of our big challenges is really, one of our greatest resources is the neighborhood fabric that we have. That's also our really important, that's the backbone of our affordable housing as well, excuse me. So I'm just wondering if you can talk to a little bit about how historic tax credits can be used in the context of these much smaller, much more sort of vulnerable projects where people may not have resources. I'm talking specifically about 2-3 family homes in less resource neighborhoods where we really want to work to preserve the fabric, but it's often challenging. There's often a balance between affordability and historic preservation.
Do you want to talk about that, Alyssa? Great question. And the office does have something called the Historic Homes Rehabilitation Tax Credit Program, which is fairly unique across the country. I'm pretty proud of it. It allows for a 30% return for homeowners to do rehabilitation on their property, and it's not nearly as fancy or as exotic as what we're talking about today. It's roof repairs and roof pointing and plaster repairs and painting. So we do have a resource for those neighborhoods and for those homeowners. They have to be owner occupied. So it's not for landlords, it's for people that intend to live in these homes. And you mentioned affordable housing. That program allows for, a typical homeowner can get 30% up to $30,000 per unit. Affordable housing nonprofits can get up to $50,000 per unit. So there is an allowance for even more help and assistance to those affordable housing groups. And neighborhood housing services of New Haven uses it frequently. NINA and Hartford uses it frequently. Habitat Humanity has been through the program before. So Connecticut is lucky to have that program that allows for homeowners to be part of this process and that it's
And it's for properties of 1 to 4 units, so that kind of multifamily housing in urban downtowns that we see struggling very often are eligible for that program, provided there's an owner occupancy aspect.
I don't want to belabor that one, but I've been talking about vernacular neighborhood buildings for 5 years. And it's not just the ability to find help with the rehabilitation, it's a bigger problem.
Yeah, to be sure.
A number of years ago, probably close to 20, the National Park Service did a case study in New Haven about ways of interpreting the Secretary's standards for rehabilitation projects, which, even with the homeowner tax credit, are beyond the capability of a lot of homeowners. That would prioritize aspects of the building that address the public realm, notably facades and to a lesser degree sides, and provide more flexibility in interpreting the standards for areas that are not part of the public realm. That never went anywhere after that study. And is there any consideration of that in reviews or the possibility of perhaps rethinking some of the applications and standards for situations of low-income owners, not just developers like EHS who have much bigger ability to deal with the requirements of the standards?
So I'll just say that, for environmental review, we review about 3,000 projects a year, and if it's HUD funded, which triggers Section 106, if it's a contributing resource, we look at just the exterior, so just that public realm. So that is guidance provided from the feds on how our office is supposed to interpret the standards. Now, we certainly advise even homes that are just contributing resources that have a significant historic factor into the interior to keep it, like if you have a grand stair, but it wasn't determined at one time to be individually eligible. If it has significant historic value in the interior, we do try to work with folks to keep them, but it's not necessarily a requirement unless our office determines a site is eligible for listing individually, which then it shifts the discussion.
I'll say from the Park Service side of things, our challenge is facilitating a national program, and how do you maintain consistency in that across every state and territory, plus all these varying sizes and scales of projects and every financial situation that comes with those. We look at things, again, according to the standards, whether the work does or does not meet the standards. If there's a scope of work that can't be due to the standards because of the financial aspect, we are not, we do not typically give someone a pass per se, just for that reason, but we do look at every project individually and carefully, and all the circumstances that go with that. But in terms of, and again, when you pair our program with other programs, there's also that give and pull. We understand that too. If there's other requirements for affordable housing, that we also marry with our requirements for the tax credit. And it's kind of the push and pull, and again, the discussion of cumulative effect, and maybe there are some particular scopes of work that may not be the best, but in the grand scope of the project, it's something that we can live with on our end in order to then allow you guys to meet whatever requirements you're also trying to comply with. So I think in that case, we would have that distinction.
So we are, okay.
I just had one question. Do you work with private developers in trying to save historic buildings also? I mean, you could work with, a lot of developers in New Haven and Hartford, or these urban areas, so you can sit down and work with them. And also, do you look at the streetscape and the setting of the buildings as well?
So, a lot of, Todd can speak to this through his work with the Protection Act, but a lot of, no. But there are certainly a number of tax credit projects that come through our office that are the result of a well-intentioned developer wanting to preserve a building that has been under scrutiny or contemplation for demolition for some time. So we do, and we are, the purpose of our office is to try to preserve buildings, and so we're more than happy to talk about our programs and what we can offer developers interested in preserving those buildings that are vulnerable. So yes, absolutely. And
yeah, I mean, the short answer is yeah, of course. So we work with private developers all the time whenever they're available to do these projects. We even, in some cases, try to help find or match threatened buildings through our trust restore preservation with developers who can save buildings. So, and to answer another question, absolutely, the streetscape is very important to neighborhoods. So we do everything we can to save those buildings, not just the facade. We want to save the entire building, and we try to find ways to do so.
So I'm so glad that we have a lot of questions, but I do see people strolling in with their lunches. So we are at time, and so I do wanna wrap this up. But we are here. We'll be here all day. And if you have any follow-up, I'm sorry we couldn't get to the rest of our posters, but I hope this conversation was helpful. And again, we're here all day. You can track us down at your lunch or break time or whatever, and we're happy to answer any additional questions. So thanks very much.